and in a form passed the Parliament last week, but we saw it in this bill, and it is a shock. I'll let the other senators talk about that, but the Greens, the Nationals and Senator Heffernan have all been concerned deeply about the impact this will have on the bush, but also about the failure of this legislation to do what it says it's going to do, and that's create carbon sinks. It's simply going to be a rorting. I'll hand across to Christine Milne, who drew attention to this last year when it was in the hands of the then Howard government, and then the other senators.
Well, everyone in rural Australia knows what a disaster the MIS schemes have been. They've driven people off the land, they've taken up water out of catchments. Everybody agrees they're a rort, and now we're seeing effectively an MIS scheme on steroids being put into the Parliament under the title carbon sinks legislation. These are not carbon sinks because the trees that are being suggested you get a tax deduction to plant do not have to be in the ground for any length of time. You can get a full tax deduction up front, and later you can just sell the property and the person can cut the trees down. There's no requirement for them to be multi-species. There is no requirement for hydrological analysis. There's no requirement for any analysis of the impact on rural communities or other land uses. This is simply a huge bonus for the big end of town. This will be taken up by the coal industry, by the airlines, it'll be taken up by the logging industry. This is a rort, an absolute rort, and it ought not to be being supported. There's an opportunity today to move for a repeal of this, and that's what we should be doing. Repeal is the only thing, and this is really a call to regional and rural Australia to say if you think you've been badly affected now by the MIS schemes, this is going to kill rural communities.
I think it's really important that on certain issues in politics that you rise above politics and understand that there is something that has slipped through, that has passed through, in this case under the so-called TLAB 2 bill. Under TLAB 2, which was never voted on, something became law that basically gave a tax deduction for certain people such as coal companies, which are probably recording record profits, to get a tax deduction to take over prime agricultural land. And in taking over prime agricultural land, they dislocate the communities that are surrounding that land, and all those other people who like to buy cheap groceries and buy cheap fruit. You've got to remember, as this agricultural land disappears, it puts upward pressure on grocery prices. Upward pressure on grocery prices, and also dislocation of local communities. And look at the classic form of it in North Queensland, where once a sugar mill falls under a sustainable level of pain, then they have to close the mill down. That means the workers are out of a job. That means the people who own a house in the town are out of luck. That means the doctor leaves town. And so it's an insidious piece of legislation. What everybody here, I feel, has in common is they want to get a resolution to this. There might be differences on how the resolution is achieved, but you try and get a resolution so that this piece of legislation, which is currently passed, is brought back and dealt with in such a fashion as we can collect the majority of numbers to get a proper effect. And if that is the case, then I'm only too happy to put aside other sort of parochial mechanisms and team up with whoever it requires to try and bring a better outcome for our nation. And that's really what it's about. I believe the people in town want to make sure they keep cheap grocery prices. I think the people in Sydney also want to make sure we look after regional areas. I don't think anybody in Australia wants a large corporate entity such as a coal mine or an energy provider to get a tax deduction so that they get a tax deduction while someone across the fence, a farm, has to live with the regular mechanism. So that's what I'd like to say. Senator Heffernan.
Look, this is obviously putting the cart before the horse, this legislation. Everyone knows it's flawed. We all want it fixed. The international panel, the governmental panel on climate change, says that in 40 to 50 years' time, 30% of the productive land of Asia is going to disappear. The food task is going to double. This is absolutely flying in the face of those statistics. This will absolutely, depending on the price of carbon, the higher the price of carbon goes, everyone should remember that at $17 a tonne, every irrigated dairy farmer becomes insolvent if they're paid to participate fully. The higher the price of the carbon goes, the better the land that will be used for this scheme. There is absolutely no regulation around it. Why I'm here today is government to let us fix this, because this is seriously, it will be, if it's left in its present form, an attack on prime agricultural land. Everyone on the planet has been modelling the future fuel task, energy task. No one's been concentrating on the food task. This is an attack on the food task. It doesn't make sense.
You said that you slipped under the radar last week.
I've got no idea. Unfortunately, I wasn't here, but Senator, the people in this group were alerted to it. Obviously, it is law at the present time. We've got to make sure through this Senate inquiry, which we'll all participate in, that we put a set of regulations around it. This is a crazy bit of stuff that's happened, and I have to say we've got to fix it. I mean, there is an obligation to the call to arms of ordinary Australians to alert the government, put pressure on the government and the opposition to fix this crazy bill.
I can explain how it happened. This bill was a coalition bill. It was Peter Costello's bill. He announced it in the May budget in 2007. The coalition brought it on for debate in the Senate the last day before the federal election. I stood up in the chamber at the time and said, you go ahead with this, and I'll wait till I tell rural and regional Australia what you're doing. You'll drive people off the land. This is an MIS scheme by another name. The upshot was that they pulled the bill last year. It didn't go through before the election. Now the government has brought it back in, and I can tell you the same people in the coalition, Mrs Turnbull and Abetz and Minchin, are just as strongly in favour of it now as they were then, and now they've got the government on side too. So this is very calculated, and how it slipped through was, it was in the bill we're dealing with now, the tax bill 1, so they added the schedule into another tax bill which was non-controversial, so it appeared, the same schedule appeared in two different bits of legislation. But we in the Senate were not alerted to that, so I thought it was coming on in the schedule for the bill it's in now, which it is, but they dealt with it in another bill last week. Now you can say it was a stuff-up, or you can say it was a deliberate thing because they knew they were going to run into this opposition in the Senate. I alerted them to that last year. I'd said this was a controversial piece of legislation. The other tax bill was deemed non-controversial because it didn't have it in it at the time. So whether it's a stuff-up, whether it was deliberate, who knows, but the upshot is that this is now law and we have to repeal it. The opportunity is there to do that.
I think what we might have to just be careful, it might be about to become law because they know we're out here.
No, it is law now. But can I just say, in addition to Senator Milne's comments, one of the reasons these things can often slip by is because this was being examined as a tax bill rather than a rural issue. And I mean, the rural spotlight wasn't shone on, it was a tax spotlight that was shone on. It needs to be fixed. I don't want to apportion blame to anyone. I just want to see this fixed so that the food task that the world has to face up to, and Australia's contribution to that food task, can be useful. I mean, this is an attack on the food task. Yeah.